Hey guys, what's up? This is Brian with Clips or Die, and the 213 era is officially over. That's right, guys. Paul George made his decision, and he decided to sign with Philly for a 4-year, $212 million contract. We kind of all assumed this would happen, or I think a majority of people assumed that this would happen when the Clippers made a statement a few hours after free agency had started. I'll go ahead and I'll put that statement up on the screen. But essentially, the Clippers made that statement, and they said that Clippers and Paul George were going to be parting ways. They were going to be going separate direction, and the Clippers were not going to be re-signing him. So I think after that statement was made, everyone kind of assumed that he was going to go to Philly. But let's go ahead and break down this statement because there's a couple things that I want to talk about. One of the big things that stood out to me in the statement was that the gap was significant, essentially stating that the Clippers and Paul George were not even close in terms to what the contract extension would be. And after the contract that Paul George signed with Philly, that makes a lot of sense. One thing that was kind of going around in the days leading up to free agency starting was that Paul George was really adamant on that 4th year, but that seemed to be a big problem with the Clippers. If you guys recall, Kawhi Leonard signed a contract extension back in January with the Clippers, and this kind of came out of nowhere. In my opinion, it kind of came out of the blue. Granted, Kawhi had been on a streak of playing really, really well. He was on fire before that extension, but with that being said, it did kind of come out of the blue. But how that relates to Paul George is that 4th year. Kawhi signed a 3-year, $153 million contract extension. It sounds like the Clippers wanted to keep him and Kawhi aligned and on the same contract, but Paul George was really adamant on that 4th year. With that being said, the Clippers stood their ground once free agency started. I think they were really just trying to call his bluff. They know that Paul George is from SoCal, Los Angeles area. His family attends games. I know that his mother has some health issues, so I think maybe they were granting on his parents being able to go to games and stuff and being something that would incentivize him to want to stay in Los Angeles. And so they called their bluff. And I think that even though they didn't think that he would leave, they were prepared to lose him. And I mean, that's exactly what happened. The worst case scenario happened, and Paul George ended up leaving for nothing. One other thing that stood out to me from the statement was they mentioned that opt-in and trade scenarios were something that was looked at. One thing that comes to mind, and the biggest one that comes to mind, is the Warriors. You know, the Warriors' names were coming up a lot. They were interested in signing Paul George. We were hearing rumors that the Clippers declined the Warriors' offers. Draymond Green went on his podcast, I believe, and he was talking about how the Clippers didn't want to play ball. Everyone was getting upset at the Clippers, right? Saying that they were stupid for not taking the Warriors' offer. But it also came out with some clarification. I believe Ramona Shelburne from ESPN clarified that the Warriors never offered Kuminga. So that's really the big piece that Clippers wanted in a sign and trade scenario was Kuminga back. That's what it sounds like. And the Warriors never offered that. So to me, it makes sense that the Clippers would not take that offer. And the big reason that the Clippers didn't want to take that offer is because the reasoning why they didn't want to sign Paul George to this max contract is because of the new CBA and all the penalties that come along with the new CBA and being in that second apron, which the Clippers have been in for the last few years. So I think that they weren't going to be willing to take on salaries for players that they didn't really want and still be in that second apron. So I think that that's kind of where the sign and trade scenario fell apart. And the Warriors, Paul George to Warriors scenario basically just fell apart. So with the sign and trade scenario out the window, Paul George goes ahead and he opts out. And to be honest, his decision, I think, ultimately was in both parties' best interest. How was it in their best interest, you may ask? I may sound stupid, but Paul George gets his bag. He gets paid. He gets the contract that he wanted. And Clippers get below the apron, which I think was the big deal to them. If you guys aren't familiar with the new CBA, if you're above the second apron for multiple years, you're a repeater, then they end up freezing your pick, and it ends up becoming the 30th pick in the draft, which is very precious to the Clippers. Keep in mind, they don't have picks. The Clippers don't have picks. So that 30th pick would be terrible if that happened. So I think that's kind of why it was in their best interest for Paul George just to take that contract, because realistically, they weren't going to offer it to them. Now the Clippers are left with more flexibility to make more roster moves, which they have been, and they've been making some pretty good roster moves thus far this free agency. And ultimately, like they mentioned in their statement, they have the opportunity to remain competitive. And if Kawhi Leonard is healthy, which has always been the big if Kawhi Leonard is healthy, then I think the Clippers have a really good chance at making the playoffs this next season. And then if we're being completely realistic, even if Paul George had re-signed with the Clippers, they weren't going to win a championship. Let's just be honest. The Clippers, they weren't with the Clippers with that team was not going to win a championship. Even if you add a couple pieces, it just wasn't going to happen. One thing I also want to talk about is Paul George himself. So Paul George with the Clippers, I loved Paul George with the Clippers. He was one of my favorite players. I loved how he always was rocking Clipper gear. He seemed like he was genuinely happy to be playing for the Clippers, which is not something that you see too often, I guess. Or I think you see it a little bit more now, but in the past, you haven't really seen too much of that. Another thing, too, was that he helped the Clippers get to their first ever Western Conference Finals appearance. And that's something that, the Clippers fans had never been able to enjoy, and we were super ecstatic about. I think it gets a little bit overshadowed sometimes with Terrence Mann's performance, but Paul George played great in that series, and I think that's not to be overlooked or forgotten. So I will always be forever grateful for that. One thing, though, is that I do feel like Paul George was done with the team before free agency started. Tamer Azarli on Twitter posted a few clips of press conferences where Paul George was asked, about his contract extension with the Clippers, and it went from being optimistic to just not even answering the question at all in the first clip and just thanking the press and leaving the press room, essentially. So I think that Paul George kind of had already made up his mind that if the Clippers did not offer him a 4-year max contract, he was going to be leaving to a different team. Whether or not he felt like that was Philly, I don't know. Of course, we all saw that clip at the finals where he was on TV and flirting with Embiid, essentially. So I don't know if he had his mind made up that he was going to go to Philly, but I think he had his mind made up that if he didn't get that max, he was going to find another team, which rightfully so. If you want to do that he has his right to do that, right? But one other thing I want to talk about Paul George as a player is that I think a lot of people forget because they see his highlights, they see that he's flashy, they see his handle, which is awesome a lot of the time, is how when Paul George is good, he's amazing. He's a great player, but when he's bad, it's bad. I think as fans, we all got used to the lackadaisical turnovers. I think we got used to the terrible passes. Just overall, Paul George just, consistently, he just was inconsistent, right? Like he was either really good or not that great. And I think his performance in the playoff series against Dallas this past season really just showed us that. And that was when I finally was just like, I'm done with Paul George and I'm okay with us losing him, even if it's for nothing. Of course, I preferred that the Clippers would have been able to get something back for him, considering we traded away a bunch of draft capital for us to get him. But at the end of the day, I was okay with him leaving the team for nothing. That's the point that I was at as a player because I was mentally exhausted by him. He was literally put in the perfect scenario to where he could demand a 4-year max contract, and the Clippers would be more likely to give it to him if he would have showed up and played like he was a max player. But Paul George did not show up and play like he was a max player, and that was a huge problem for me. and fans as well. That over the years, it just took a mental toll, I think, on a lot of fans. And maybe that's why he has BetterHelp as one of his sponsors on his podcast, because he knows that his style of play is his fans are gonna need some therapy after watching him play. But all jokes aside, honestly, Paul George as a player over the last 5 years, I think Clipper fans just saw it. Paul George never took accountability. He constantly had excuses, constant excuses as to why, we played a certain way or why we weren't meeting up to the expectations. Whatever Paul George asked for, he got. He wanted a point guard because he didn't want to be catch and shoot player. He got point guard. And then when that point guard didn't work out, it was something else, another point guard. And so it was just constant excuses. And not only that, but Paul George constantly puts his foot in his mouth. He says one thing and then he says another thing, constantly contradicting himself. It baffles me as a fan. But just kind of to wrap it up, I mean, really, with Paul George, to summarize this tenure with the Clippers, Paul George, you just were, I guess, consistently inconsistent. You overpromised and underdelivered constantly. You said that you owed the Clippers and fan base a championship, and then you turn around and you do this. Honestly, I wish you the best in Philly. I hope it works out. But I think that your tenure here it left a lot to be desired. And so with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and do what the Clippers probably won't do, and I'm going to retire your jersey. The only thing is I'm going to retire it to the back of my closet. Thanks for watching.